So Caleb, in your first book, Messy Grace, you actually talk about being raised by two gay parents.
By three.
By three gay parents. Okay.
Yes.
Explain how that works and what was that like for you?
Yeah, so my parents were both professors at the University of Missouri, Columbia, and they taught things like subjects like philosophy, law, rhetoric, literature, medieval literature, so on and so forth. When I was 2, they got a divorce, and both of them went into same-sex relationships. My dad was in several different relationships, never had a monogamous partner, but my mom was in a 22-year relationship with a woman who's a psychologist named Biola. They moved to Kansas City, Missouri, which is about 2 hours away. I think this is, sorry, I'm going to try to fix that. There you go. They moved to Kansas City, Missouri, which is about 2 hours away from Columbia, and I was raised in the LGBTQ plus community. My mom and her partner joined the local board of directors for GLAAD. When I was in preschool, elementary age, they took me to bars and clubs and parties and campouts and pride parades. I remember this one pride parade. There were all these Christians at the end of the parade, quote-unquote Christians, because I don't think they were saved, but I need to be careful about that. They were holding up signs saying, "God hates you, turn or burn," and if that wasn't offensive enough, they were spraying people who would go try to talk to them with water and urine, saying, "This is what Jesus thinks of you."
Wow.
And I remember looking at my mom when I was 9, seeing this, and I said, "Why are they doing this?" And she said, "Well, Caleb, they're Christians. Christians hate gay people. If you are not like them, they will not like you." And that stuck with me. And I saw young men in my mom's community who were dying of AIDS, who were ignored by their Christian, parents. And I ended up, by the time I got to high school, my life was just warped and out of control. And I got invited to this a conservative Christian Bible study. And I thought, this is going to be perfect. I'm going to go and be a pretend Christian. I'm going to be a ninja Christian. I'm going to learn about the Bible. Then I'm going to dismantle their faith, which actually that turned out well. And so when I went there, I realized that Jesus was not like the people on the street corners. I realized that Paul was not like the people who were ignoring their kids. That Jesus, Paul, Peter, and anyone else of the New Testament leaders Jesus was perfect, but the rest were imperfect, but they had deep theological convictions and expectations for how we should live life, treat one another, build our faith, establish our character, but they also had very meaningful relationships with people that were nothing like them. And those people actually liked them back. And so I ended up giving my life to Jesus. And I was really nervous to tell my parents, because if you can imagine, and some of you have experienced this, a teenager coming out to their conservative Christian parents. I was a 16-year-old coming out as a Christian who wanted to be a pastor to my 3 gay parents. Yeah. And the result, they kicked me out of the house. And so a lot of people, they're like, "Man, how could that happen?" And I said, because everybody reacts similar to fear. Fear is a constant companion in life. Fear will cause you to do horrible things. And one of my favorite philosophers / theologian, I can't prove that he's Christian, but I think he is. You need to be careful with that. He's a little guy, big ears, named Yoda. In one of the Star Wars movies, I think he's saved. In one of the Star Wars movies, he said, fear is a path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. And eventually my parents let me back in. Eventually I went to college, seminary here. Eventually my parents started going to a church I was preaching at in Dallas, Texas, and the church there treated them really well. And at the ages of 69 and 70, in the summer of 2013, they both accepted Jesus. And so I've been a pastor, and what I do now is I travel, and I help, and I consult and speak and write. I have another book coming out in a year or so, whenever it gets done. But basically I help Christian organizations, churches, learning institutions leverage grace and truth so that they can create belonging. And specifically with churches to create belonging where anyone can attend. So that's what I do. That's my story.
Great. Thank you for a little snippet of your story. You know, the second book, if I could latch onto that word fear, you're talking about the God of tomorrow. And in this book, you're talking about how to overcome the fears of today by hoping in the God who holds tomorrow. What does that look like for us as Christians, and how do we do that?
Well, I think, we will naturally fear. Like, fear is always a companion, like I said, in life. You can't get away from it. You can learn how to control it, but it's always going to be with you. And so we naturally fear two things, or there are two things that cause us to be afraid. When we face a person, a group, or a circumstance that we don't understand or that makes us feel out of control. So anytime we feel out of control or like we don't understand something, we automatically feel fear. And there are two things that we need to do to stop this, because fear, I think, is what is causing the chaos of our society today. Two things we need to do. Number one, this book, I looked at Jesus and Peter, Paul, and other people, and they lived in a more brutal society than what we live in today in La Mirada. Brutal, right? Brutal society. Bad joke, anyway. It's not a brutal society compared to the first century under Nero. But yeah, here's the deal. They lived under the occupation of the Roman Empire, as many of you know, led by a pagan dictator. Their religion was somewhat prohibited, not a ton, but somewhat. They were taxed, which they thought was illegal. They watched their brothers and sisters and family members get killed, and that's what they had to submit to. And yet, Jesus, Peter, Paul, the other New Testament leaders were able to give hope during their day because they looked forward and they focused on God, and they believed that God had already created tomorrow. He owns it, and that he was going to journey with them into tomorrow. And you and I have the luxury of being able to open up the Bible to Revelation 21 and 22, right? And we can read the end of the story. We can read Revelation 21, verse 3 and 5, that there will be no more mourning or lying or death or pain or lawyers or anything in the new heavens and the new earth, because the old order of things has passed away. And the second thing that we need to do is if fear makes us back away, or fear makes us try to micromanage, or fear makes us indifferent, if fear makes us flee, then the opposite is to get close to a person, a circumstance, a group, to understand them. And that's empathy.
Yeah.
Empathy is the answer. Looking to God, focusing on him, and living your life in empathy. Empathy is neither agreement or rejection, it's acknowledgement.
Yeah. What are some tangible things that you see Christians fear as they look at tomorrow?
Christians fear, and I'm lumping myself in here with this.
Please.
And you.
I'm definitely part of it. I have a lot more fear than you.
You, not that guy over there, but you, yeah. I think that we fear we fear losing that which we have not surrendered over to God. And we fear, and if we're not continually cultivating our intimacy with God on a regular basis, on a daily basis, if we're not spending time with him in prayer and reading and worship and, engaging the church fully and giving and, of our finances and serving, how can we be close with God? Some people might say, well, that's possible. I say, no, it's not possible. You might be saved. You're not close with God. Because when the storms come, the storms rip apart everything you are, and all you have left is your faith and your character. And so why do I build my intimacy with God right now? Not only because I love God, and it's not out of obligation. It's because I love him. He's my Father. But also I know that when the storm hits, I want to believe with everything I am that God is with me. And you have so many Christians in America who, because of religious liberty, which I'm not against, I love religious freedom.
Yeah.
And I think we should stand up for it. But it is not a necessity to be a Christian. And yet here in America, we have made it a necessity in our own minds. And people are afraid of losing what they have not surrendered to God. People fear the change of culture and society, but society is made up of people. People are always changing, and people are crazy, especially on Facebook and Twitter. People are insane. And so society is always changing. You can't stop that. What we need to learn to do is to think like missionaries. We contextualize to wherever society is, but our core doctrine, it never changes, and neither does our hope, because God never changes.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I have that image of Christians in the beginning of this conversation, and I wonder, what if you could give Christians a special skill, what would that special skill be in the way that we relate with people that we don't get?
I would say two things, and I think they're both kind of saying the same thing. Number one, let your differences drive you to people, not from them. Because here's the biggest problem. One of the biggest problems in our society, and what fear creates, is false dichotomies. There's a reason why they're called false dichotomies. You think there are only two options, and they're the extremist options. And we live in a society where people think, I don't have a voice unless I'm on this side of the extremism or that side. So you look at an issue as either immorality or injustice. And sometimes it is immorality, sometimes it is injustice, but more times than not, it's somewhere in between.
Yeah.
Okay, so we need to create dialogue. You can't have dialogue in an extremist society filled with false dichotomies. And dialogue, I love how they describe dialogue in the book Crucial Conversations. They define dialogue as the freedom to express your opinions, thoughts, ideas, and emotions without consequences. And we don't have that right now. Because if you try to speak out with what you believe, you're attacked. And usually we do that without getting to know that which with we disagree. The other thing, besides the fact that our differences need to drive us to people, the other thing that we need to do is we need to learn that there's a big difference between acceptance and agreement. And we live in false dichotomies. We live in a world where people say, if you do not agree with my decision to be in this relationship, to live in this city, to go to this school, to have this political affiliation, then you do not accept me. And what we're doing is we're creating a false idol. I mean, God never created anything other than himself to be our main identity. And when we see no difference between acceptance and agreement, we basically found our identity in whatever we're protecting. Real, true, authentic love is always based on acceptance, loving people no matter what, whether you disagree with them or agree with them, that you treat them with kindness no matter what. But agreement, that's not optional. Cheap love is based on agreement because eventually you'll disagree. And I think that, again, we live in a society where people try to make things that God never created to define us. And I think if we learned the difference between acceptance and agreement, I think our society would improve, and I think we as Christians would find it easier to engage people we don't understand, we disagree with, or maybe we're afraid of.
Great. Well, Caleb, you said a lot. Okay, I'm going to call a timeout here. And I'm going to invite our worship team to lead us in a reflection time. And if you guys can text in and social media and questions, we'll get to them after this song. Well, Caleb, we're going to jump right in. Here's our first question. What do you think Christians are afraid of that keeps us from loving people who are different?
Because every human is afraid of loving people that are different.
Next question.
Yeah, Christians are humans. Humans are messed up. Every human being is afraid of what's different. And some of it's instinct, survival in the head. Some of it is a lack of experiences they've had. And the dangerous thing when Christians are afraid to love people who are different from them is, number one, it depends on what you mean by love. Agreement doesn't mean love. Love means valuing, loving someone no matter what, even if you disagree with them. The second thing is that a lot of the times we use theology and doctrine as an excuse to not love people or to act poorly towards people or to bully them. And you see this in the church, you see this in the school world, you see this wherever you work. Christians do that all the time. And our pride allows us to leverage Scripture to justify our selfishness and our insecurities. We throw God underneath the mat. I don't think he likes that. Like, if I were God, I wouldn't. I'm sure he likes it even less. That's my opinion.
All right. Well, here's the second question. If getting closer to God will help us deal with fear, what are some practical ways we can work to deepen our relationship or intimacy with God?
So I think that's a great question. I'd say two things. Number one, have a variety of quiet time with God. I would always listen to sermons and chapels where somebody would say, my grandpa set an example for me. I'd get up and he'd be up at 5 a.m. reading his Bible already, drinking a coffee. Okay, I'm not awake then. Okay, that's good for grandpa. But God's not even up when grandpa's up. He's still asleep, okay? So for me, that doesn't work. You got to find what works for you, whether if you drive a lot, you can have that time in the car. And so what I do is and I schedule this time intentionally, but one day I'll read the Bible and do some prayer. Another day I'll go out on a walk and pray and think through things. Another day, maybe I'll listen to a sermon and a worship song. I just do different things. So having a variety of how you connect with God. I mean, if you go out on a date with someone, hopefully you don't do the same thing all the time. Every single night when you eat dinner, you don't eat the same thing. I mean, unless you're a college student. And eventually you won't. You'll eat different things, hopefully. Trust him, it'll happen. But we like a variety in everything. There's even a variety in the classes we take. And so why can't we have that same variety with God? And the second thing I'd say that helps us grow closer with God is I would ask every single person who says, I just feel like I'm in a lull with God. Here's my question. What's the first name of the person you are consistently sharing your faith with right now? I'm not talking about here on our campus. I'm not talking about on Facebook. I'm not talking on Instagram. I mean somebody that you have prayed about, that you're intentionally investing in so that you can tell them about Jesus. You can be a good example. You can invite them to church with you. And some of you are like, oh, you're just saying invite them to church because you're a pastor. Meh. No. Okay? I'm not. And I'll tell you why. Do you know that it is easier for people to usually find Jesus and follow him in the midst of community rather than isolation? And so, I mean it. Whatever church you go to, invite them. But if you are not consistently sharing your faith with someone who is far from God, I do not understand how we can be on fire for God, at least not very long. Because sharing your faith, it's not a gift. It's not an option. It's a command. You have to do it. And otherwise, we misappropriate the blood of Christ.
Wow. Strong words. Here's another one. Do you have advice on finding the balance between truth and love, on approaching controversial issues with both understanding and empathy, as well as avoiding personal compromise?
Yeah, my advice is don't try to find balance. Nobody ever has. You won't. So don't try to find balance. Here's my advice. Learn to get uncomfortable with your faith. Learn to live in the tension. Your faith is filled with tension. You and I know it, but we don't know it all the time. We don't realize it. It's like a rubber band, okay? If you just hold a rubber band on one side, this is a small little baby rubber band, okay? You can imagine it right here. But if you just hold a rubber band by this side, it serves no purpose. It's flimsy. It's weak. It's annoying. If you saw somebody walking down the street just like this, you'd slap them to try to help them come back to reality. If you hold the rubber band by this side, same thing. It serves no purpose. It's flimsy. It's weak. It's annoying. That's what happens when we don't live in the tension. Now, are there some things that are absolute? Yeah. God exists. He's triune in his nature. That Jesus is the only way to God, that God inspired the Bible. The mission of the church is to make disciples, helping people to find and follow Jesus. Jesus is coming back. He physically resurrected. Those are absolutes, okay? But a lot of other things, they're not. There's tension. And we got to stop trying to balance it and learn how to live in both, like take grace and truth. Jesus was gracious when people expected him to be truthful, and he was truthful when people expected him to be gracious. So don't try to figure out a pattern, because you won't, okay? Because he's Jesus, and he's got mad skills like that, okay? He doesn't always let us know every single pattern, but here's what we do know, is that Jesus was not worried about other people's opinions, and he was okay with confusing people. And you've got to be okay with confusing people, because here's the deal. You're already confusing in your faith. You're weird. And here's why, okay? Look at this. If we believe in grace and truth, where's the power? The power lies in the tension of the two. Instead of just taking a side, the power lies in the tension of the two when we learn how to live in tension. And we believe in one God, but the Trinity. Hello. We believe that Jesus is fully God, fully human. We believe the Bible is inspired of God, written by people, love God, love people. We believe that God is in control, but allows us to make decisions, that you can be a good preacher and still have hair. Come on. So don't try to balance grace and truth or other things. Get comfortable with being confused with confusing people and not having all the answers, and ask God to give you wisdom on when to lean in which one.
Great. What else do you have in your pocket? Because
Gum.
okay.
Want it?
Maybe later. How's that? Okay. Here's another question. What did it look like for your church in Dallas to treat your parents well?
Oh, man, that's an awesome question. When I originally, when I was in college, I preached at a church that was the largest church per capita in the world. It was in a town of 50 people in the middle of Missouri, and we had 25 of those 50 in our church. Half our town was one for Christ. Come on, that's awesome, right? Yeah, thanks. When one of them would die, we'd have to go try to get, another one, because our numbers would go down significantly. And so I invited my mom to church with me there. I had preached there for like a year and a half while I was in college, just on the weekends. And I showed up the next Sunday after I invited my mom, and there were two elders that wanted to talk to me. And they said, Caleb, if you want to keep preaching here, don't you ever bring somebody like your mother again.
Wow.
They said, we don't like those people. And I said, I don't like you right now. And they said, why would you bring her here? And I said, because. I said, my theological conviction is that God designed sexual intimacy for the expression in marriage between one man and one woman, and anything outside of that is not part of his intention for sexual intimacy. I said, now, my mom is not there. She doesn't even believe in Jesus. I'm more worried about her believing in Jesus than her theology on sex. Because I think God is much better at life change than I am. And that doesn't mean we don't confront difficult issues or issues of holiness. That means that my first priority is to say, hey, here's this cool guy named Jesus. He has an eternity's expert in changing lives. And so I told them I quit, and they said, you can't quit. We need you to preach today. I said, you don't want that after this conversation. And they said, no, we want you to. And so I said, well, you'll get a sermon. And I went up there and I took my sermon I had written, it was on fasting. Who cares about that, right? And I get up there and I ripped it up, threw it away. And I preached on grace and truth and love and conviction. And I walked out of there and I'm like, man, I never want to be a part of a church that is a country club, because Jesus did not die on the cross for a Pharisee factory that's masquerading as a church.
Wow.
Fast forward to Dallas. My parents started attending. Not everybody in the church, including myself, agreed with the relationships they were in. But here's the thing. Your disagreements and my disagreements with other people does not determine their value or worth. I can disagree with someone theologically or politically and still be a really good friend and still treat them like I would anyone else. You know why? Because we're commanded to love. And so what ended up happening was eventually my parents came to Christ because people invested in them. People understood the difference between acceptance and agreement. And I'm forever grateful for that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Here's another question. What do you mean by America has created Christianity to be a necessity?
I don't know what that means. Did I say that?
I'm trying to think through what that means too, and I'm wondering,
It's really annoying when you have to interpret your own words and you probably said something wrong. You're like, I don't know what that means. I don't think America has created Christianity to be a necessity. I think that Christians in America think that even if they won't admit it, and maybe deep down inside, and I should be careful and say the majority of everyday Christians, not you people, you have it down straight. I know that. You're perfect. I got it. Me too. Not him. What I mean by that is that many of the Christians that we encounter in our churches believe that religious freedom is a necessity to being a Christian in America. And so we end up relying too much on the political system. which, should we engage politics? Absolutely. Should we engage the government? Yes. God did it in both the Old and the New Testaments over and over again, okay? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that sometimes that dependence and thinking that we can't follow Jesus without religious freedom, whenever our religious freedom is threatened, that somehow that subtracts from our Christianity, that causes us to be afraid, when actually, when you look at the book of Acts, quite the opposite happened. Anytime the church was persecuted or oppressed, it grew. There's a reason why the church is growing in North Korea, in India, in Syria, in China, in places of Indonesia that are capitals ruled by Muslim terrorists. There's a reason why. Here's the reason why, okay? Because it makes you decide what you really believe. Christianity is no longer just another category in your life, like taking the kids to soccer practice or taking an ethics class. Christianity is now everything you see your life through. It is not a religion. It is a relationship you rely on. That's why.
All right. That's right. Here's another question, Caleb. Do you have advice for what friendship can look like between people who accept and love each other but disagree with each other's lifestyle?
Yeah. First of all, I wouldn't call it lifestyle. I'd call it life choice. Because lifestyle is such a big umbrella word, and I think you can apply this to anything, a life choice to be maybe in a relationship that you don't agree with theologically, or a relationship that you think will harm the other person, or a codependent relationship, or maybe using drugs, or cheating on the IRS, even though the IRS cheats on us. That kind of thing. My advice would be focus on what you have in common. Okay, that doesn't mean that you change your conviction. You probably shouldn't, okay? But you only change your conviction when you believe that your theological conviction is a necessity for you to be in a relationship with that other person. And if you believe that, you need to go back and rethink your theology when Jesus said, if somebody forced you to go 1 mile, go with them 2, because he was talking about Roman soldiers forcing Jewish people to carry their pack for 1 mile. And Jesus is like, the people that have crucified your family and friends and taken over your land, the people that you don't like and they're barbarians, serve them. Okay? Jesus didn't agree with what Rome was doing, but what did he say? Serve the people that you and I disagree with. But if the other person is saying, hey, unless you think this choice is theologically okay, I'm not going to be in your life, you can never allow somebody's oversensitivity or false sense of oppression trick you into changing your theology. If you do that, you're a watershed for anything. You will end up falling for anything. You have got to be firm in what you believe. And if you're like, I don't know what I think about that. Well, Jesus did it, right? Read John 4, the woman at the well. Read the story in Luke 19 about Zacchaeus. He did it all the time. He loved people and was in a relationship with the people he didn't agree with. And so I think that's a better example than some of the celebrities on Twitter.
All right. Well, Caleb, as we close, we ask a question. It's, what biblical principles or passages have influenced your thinking about our topic today?
This is going to sound weird, but I'm going to read real quick.
Yeah, please.
Romans 12, 18. Romans 9 through 18 is huge, but Romans 12, 18, where I think it's in here. Oh, there it is, right there. Yeah. Romans 12, 18, it says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with anyone. And then Romans 13, 8 through 10, where Paul basically said, whoever loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. Love does no harm to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. And what really inspired me, my thinking on this, was the whole idea of forgiveness. And I know that sounds backwards. You're like, how are you going to tie this in? Oh, you just watch.
I'm ready.
Okay. There's a great book that you should read. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's by Dr. Martin Luther King, and it's called Strength to Love. And it was written a couple years before his assassination, and his wife published it later on. And it is one of the deepest books I've ever read on love, and forgiveness and acceptance without agreement. And basically, it's about how he came to forgive and love anyone who was racist against him. There's a story about this Caucasian girl during one of Dr. King's marches who came up and spit on his face in the middle of the parade. Now, if that happened today, what do you think would have happened? Dude, she'd be clobbered with a sign or whatever. Back then, everybody stopped. They're looking to see what King would do, and he took out his handkerchief, wiped the loogie off of his face, put it back in. He looked at her and smiled and said, "Now, young lady, you're way too beautiful to be doing things like that." And then he just walked on. A year later, she became a Christian and started fighting for civil rights. What would have happened if he would have gone off on her? And this book, Strength to Love, I think it's in chapter 5 where Dr. King talks about loving your enemies. And I know I'm going over. Hold on, it's good. Where he talks about loving your enemies, he says that whoever is devoid of forgiveness is devoid of love. That if you want to really love people, you got to get good at forgiving people, including yourself. And that if you really want to forgive somebody that's really hurt you, or a group of people you've never met that you don't like, and you feel like you need to forgive them, here's what you need to do. You need to understand that the way a person or a group or a couple people have offended you does not represent everything they are. That's what Dr. King says. You have to look for the good in them, because everybody's got evil and everybody's got good in them somewhere, morality. And so you've got to realize, and when we realize that the way we were hurt by the person does not necessarily represent everything they are, when we realize that, we're able to forgive, we're able to love, we're able to see good in them, we're able to pray for them. That his work, Strength to Love, read that book, that influenced me.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.